Sometimes at the beginning of a film we might think things because of, maybe, the production plate. Oh, it's a bad robot production. I wonder how they're going to get Cloverfield in here. Oh, it's a Miramax. I hope they had good catering. I think Orion is probably one of the most nostalgia-inducing. Yes, Orion had a hand in Robocop, Terminator, Amadeus, Silence of the Lambs, First Blood, and much, much more. But even with 20 Oscars and billions of dollars of box office revenue, it couldn't stop itself from going bankrupt. Orion Pictures, which originally operated from 1978 to 1992, winning the Best Picture Oscar 4 times in those 14 years, still has an incredible reputation. But despite, in 1991, making $191 million from the Addams Family and $272 million from the Silence of the Lambs, which also won the Best Picture Academy Award, despite producing and distributing films that were commercially and critically very successful, by the time these films came out, Orion was already mortally wounded. Orion started out in 1978 with the intention of financing movies that would be distributed by Warner Brothers, with that distribution and marketing controlled by Orion. From the very beginning, the intention of Orion was to leave the filmmakers the creative control to pretty much do what they wanted, and up until the end of Orion, it was known as a director's studio. Orion, however, was financed with what might be called junk bond financing. Essentially, they had high-interest debt. $100 million of such credit may sound huge, but even back then in the 70s, for a company looking to produce and distribute wide releases, it was arguably not enough. Still, Orion started strongly, releasing 8 films in 1979, although Life of Brian only in the US. Out of the 23 films Orion had released by the end of 1981, only a third had been profitable. Still, Orion wanted to get out of the shadow of Warner Brothers and set up its own distribution network, so it bought Filmways, and ended up making a bit of television. A co-production with Warner Brothers produced the very profitable Caddyshack. They picked up the production of Arthur from Paramount, and that film went on to make $95 million on only a $7 million budget. And later, in the 80s, Orion distributed the likes of Platoon, and produced the likes of Throw Momma from a Train. Those were, without a doubt, absolute wins. But also, if you look at everything Orion did in the 1980s, you'll also see a lot of movies that have been largely forgotten. The 80s had some glorious successes for Orion, but some flops too, such as Flesh and Blood, The House on Carroll Street, and whatever, because you've never heard of these anyway. It also had a lot of films that were pretty meh financially. John Kluger's Metromedia began buying Orion stock in 1986 and took over approximately 67% of Orion on the 20th of May 1988, after a period of box office success, thanks to Platoon, Hoosiers, and Hannah and Her Sisters. Now, I've read analysis in the past that says the main reason Orion failed was it never had enough capital from the very beginning, which I think is quite possibly true. The movie business is notoriously volatile, and I think major studios often need to have enough capital in reserve to carry them through trouble spots which might last years. However, Kluger was a very rich man, the richest in America for a while. I think his patience dwindled extremely quickly with Orion, and I think that's because of its weird accountancy practices. Orion, it seems, was probably in financial turmoil by the time Kluger arrived on the scene. They sold the distribution rights to many of the films they produced to raise funds. On the outside, however, Orion may have looked more buoyant than they actually were because, it's rumoured, they were overinflating their financial reports. 1989 and 1990 were extremely poor for Orion, and although a bigger studio could have probably survived a similar stretch of underperforming films, Orion couldn't. Notably, Valmont made barely $1 million back on an estimated $33 million budget, and Everybody Wins made $1.3 million on a $19 million budget. What an ironic title. At the end of 1990, Orion did strike it big with a deal to distribute Dances with Wolves, which made $424 million on a $22 million budget. The Silence of the Lambs in the following year and the Addams Family were also successful, but that was undermined by Orion quickly selling the Addams Family to Paramount during its making, on Krug's orders. If you look at Goldcrest, you might argue that that studio went down because it started making weighty, expensive films that no one wanted to see. Goldcrest, I think, in many ways is quite admirable. It wanted to make good movies. It just didn't get the balance right between good and appealing to a mass audience. But if you look at Orion, that studio made a fortune from The Silence of the Lambs, but still owed about $1 billion. Orion made plenty of weighty, good films that were very profitable. It went down because it made expensive films people did want to go and see, but many, many more that people didn't. Additionally, Orion is said to have overspent on unnecessary overheads, with execs living at large, and as mentioned before, to have massaged some figures here and there in the 80s, which made the company look healthier than it was and deferred mounting debt. So I suppose in the most boring conclusion ever, Orion failed because it didn't spread its debt out. Orion crashed, filing for bankruptcy in December of 1991 because it didn't get those medium-sized films that would only play domestically to hit. When things turned to slosh, they didn't have the cash reserves to get them through it, so ended up having to sell distribution rights to survive in the immediate short term. The exact distribution rights they needed to survive in the not-so-immediate short term. Orion emerged from bankruptcy later in the 90s and is now a subsidiary of MGM, operating as a standalone studio, producing movies since 2013, such as